we are discussing the outcomes at the 12th Ministerial Conference in the WTO, where India was represented by Minister Piyush Goyal. We've also seen that at the end of the meet, India has hailed it as a victory and it has positive outcomes for India. Especially when we see on the fisheries issues, it is now that there would be a check on illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing in India's waters and elsewhere. There have also been other developments on the intellectual property rights, for instance, which is a stand which has been vindicated by India. Ambassador Shashank, when you see this outcome at WTO and in many of India's positions have been vindicated, how do you look at the progress?
It was a very complex negotiation, and I should congratulate our Minister Piyush Goyal for having come out with a successful conclusion which can be appreciated and lauded by most of the Indians. Because I remember when we were negotiating the TRIPS agreement in early 2000s, it was so difficult. They were willing to accept for the medicines under pressure from the various groups of developing countries. We had set up BASIC, we had set up other kind of groups also with other countries. But they were not willing to include vaccines. And this has continued for a very long time. So I'm glad that vaccines have finally been introduced into the WTO pledges. And I think that will really help very much the developing countries, particularly those who have suffered because of the shortage of vaccines. India has done its lot by contributing vaccines under the various programs, bilateral as well as the UN. So I think one has to congratulate the WTO Director General also, who was earlier the director of Gavi, the UN program for vaccine development and distribution. So that is one. Secondly, food security. This is very important that what India has achieved, because there were a lot of criticisms of India for not selling the food grains in the open market when the prices are rising constantly. And so India had to take a decision to protect the food security for its own population. So I think there also we have been able to come out successfully. So that is another important thing. For fisheries, I must say that Quad has recently signed some agreements to help with the regulating of the fisheries by setting up cyber network of satellites. India should have done that long time ago. If you remember, Law of Seas Conference had set up long time ago that the resources of the sea should be equitably shared mostly by the countries of the coast. India has not been able to develop those GPS, and a lot of illegal fishing goes on in India's waters. And I think, therefore, whatever we have achieved is very good. Of course, practically, we work out these decisions on the ground and see that the people who are well entrenched already and making profits, whether the pharmaceutical companies, whether the illegal poachers, or those who wanted to corner the food grains in an open market, they do not try to sabotage it.
Ambassador Shashank, we also see that one of the outcomes of this WTO meet has been the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS as we call it. The decision will boost export, vaccine equity, accessibility and affordability. A country can authorize production of vaccines patent elsewhere, and there would be no consent required, as well as there would be no limit on exports. So this seems to be a very welcome outcome of the WTO, especially when the world is still coming out of the COVID pandemic. And we also saw that during the pandemic, how difficult it was for the poorer, smaller nations to get access to vaccines. So how does this impact the world in a more fair fashion as we go forward?
I think it's an extremely important step. If you recall, the manufacturers or the patent holders were initially saying that they have been able to develop these vaccines so fast because of the patent protection. On the other hand, if you see that India, which had been asking for these patents to be waived in favor of national emergencies for vaccines, India was able to develop its own vaccines also. On the other hand, we found that many Indians who had taken the Covishield, which was produced in India based on a patent held by AstraZeneca, were not allowed to enter UK for a long time because they were willing to accept AstraZeneca but not willing to accept the Covishield produced in India based on that. So that was the other iniquity. Thirdly, when India wanted to send out its vaccines, so those developed by India, they could send them out. But the others which had been being done under license from the international patent holders, it was not possible at all. So therefore, I think there will be greater equity. And if you remember that some of the manufacturers were insisting for sovereign guarantees from the countries that if they could not pay for these vaccines, then many of their assets could be acquired by those companies, including their embassies abroad. I think this was very, very iniquitous kind of a world relations. And one was thinking that Ukraine, of course, now we are facing this problem in Europe and on Ukraine conflict. But already the developing world had been suffering from so much, from food insecurity and then from the vaccine non-availability. So So I'm glad that this has been worked out. India was being considered as one of the negotiation breaker, but then ultimately through hard negotiations and the guidance, I think, to the Indian delegation given firmly by our Prime Minister, we were able to get the support of all the players, and we were able to talk to developed countries like USA, UK, and the European Union and get their support. And I think that is also a very important role that was played by India.
Mr. Shashank, we also see that another outcome has been that the agenda decided on WTO reforms, which will make the WTO a more efficient, agile body. And the dispute settlement body will be revived and employ its expected role in settling trade disputes. This we see has been something which has been under discussions for quite a while, the need for reforms in WTO. So how much does this help and put confidence in the WTO that finally we will see some reforms in the body? And, this has been an ongoing discussion asking for reforms in the UN, UNSC, WTO. How positive is this outcome that, yes, finally we might actually see some reforms taking place?
I think what has happened is that initially when the Ukraine conflict had started, there was a feeling among the Western countries that they would be able to bring a quick end to the conflict by inflicting heavy pain on the Russians. It has not happened. And now there is a lot of realism which has come about. That has helped in making the international organizations, international bodies a little bit more pragmatic, because now they are getting support of all the countries. One, those who can benefit from these conclusions, and secondly, those who are holding back on reforms in these organizations, now they are more willing to take advantage of the possibility of getting all the countries along with them. If you remember that this European conflict was being forced on countries in Asia, Africa, Middle East and others to follow suit. But all these countries, they were already suffering so much, so they did not want to suffer much more. And so therefore, they tried to keep themselves out of this conflict. And our foreign minister at that time had said that you always regard an Asian conflict as an Asian conflict, and you advise India, Pakistan, India, China to improve their relations. Whereas you consider that European conflict is a world conflict. So all the countries all over the world should fall in line with whatever your decisions are. So I think that has perhaps sunk in gradually, and especially among the policymakers, there is a greater realization that they have to get the support of other countries, willing support, not by forcing it down their throats.
Mr. Shashank, we also see focuses on working towards increasing productivity goals and addressing bottom of the world. And we've also seen that because of climate change, etc., the production levels have kind of wavered. How far do you think this outcome will help us in achieving a world where there actually is no hunger and you can actually be assured of food security?
Well, UN and FAO have adopted several resolutions for freedom from hunger campaigns, because we have seen in the past tremendous famines affecting the Sudano-Sahelian region. And under the British colonial rule, we had seen at least 7 or 8 major famines in India, which had lost several million lives, maybe 25, 30 million lives during the British colonial rule. So therefore, there has always been this feeling among the developing world that they must come out of this sign of hunger among their poor people. I think India has worked tremendously on this score. The climate change, of course, makes things very difficult. While our production has gone up for food grains and other crops, but this time we have seen temperatures going up in the main crop belts to 45 to 50 degrees, which is really high. So I think these are the climate change issues which we need to take into account. We have to take care of the food security for our own people first. Then we have taken certain obligations in bilateral and other regional negotiations with other countries. And so we take care of them. India has been doing all that. But food security cannot mean that, India should put all its food grains in the open market, which can then be cornered by all kinds of international, multinational corporations who study these situations very closely, how to take full advantage of the market problems and market opportunities.
Ambassador Shashank, just as we wind up our conversation, I just wanted to ask that we've always seen this gap between, what gets declared at the end of the summits and the implementation. How optimistic would you say should India be, or how cautiously optimistic should India be going ahead that these things would be implemented and the words that have been put out on paper would be implemented on the ground?
Well, one thing I would suggest is that in life-saving matters like vaccines and others, we should move very strongly and get the support of the people of the world to these decisions. I think they will get implemented. Secondly, we need to publicize the results very widely all over so that there is no going back. We have seen in the past that any decision taken positively at various meetings internationally are then tried to be sabotaged or one tries to go back on them in the subsequent meetings. So I think we should try to avoid that possibility because we have seen many of these things happening in other international negotiations, and therefore, since it's a very important decision for the livelihoods of so many billions of people in the world, I think we need to move ahead on this. And we have the support of the political leaders of the world, both developed and developing countries, and therefore we need to keep them on board with us in implementing these decisions.
With these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.